I learned a great lesson from Archbishop Tutu, the first chair of the elders. We were on a panel together in New York, and he was accused by the moderator of being an optimist. And he said, "Oh no, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." And the reason he said that, I came to understand, is hope generates an ability to say, I can do something about this. And it catalyzes action.
That's the voice of Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Kalina and Alex Hall.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. And Alex, good to have you back on the podcast. How was your Thanksgiving?
Hey, Tom. Happy to join as always. My Thanksgiving was great. We had a big crew for the first time in years, and my family does a grilled turkey versus oven turkey competition. So that is always a treat, and the grilled turkey won per every year, but it's always nice to have two birds. You never know. Maybe one day the oven will win out. How was your turkey?
That sounds great. I had a very nice Thanksgiving. I cooked the Thanksgiving this year in the oven, but I do want to get your recipe for the barbecue grill because that sounds delicious. What can I say? But no, we had a great time. My kids came down from Philadelphia to see us in Tacoma Park. We had a terrific time Thanksgiving with them. And then we drove up over the weekend to New York City to see my family up there. And the traffic wasn't too bad, so it was all good.
Definitely something to be thankful for there. So what do you have for us this week on the nuclear front?
Interesting news out of China, where we're seeing some rare public protests demanding political reform. Over the last few days, there have been protests from Shanghai to Beijing, sparked by anger over China's zero COVID policies. Many are demanding that the government lift the COVID lockdown, and some are calling for greater democracy and freedom at the same time. Some protesters have even called for the removal of Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who has overseen mass testing, lockdowns, enforced quarantines, and digital surveillance for nearly 3 years. Some of this, I'm sure, driven by the fact that China's strict COVID policies seem out of step with the rest of the world, which is moving to lift restrictions. In Ukraine, President Zelensky is warning that the country must prepare for new missile attacks from Russia, as millions remain without power due to relentless bombardment of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And meanwhile, in the West, preparations were stepped up to boost humanitarian aid to Ukraine so the population can enjoy some warmth during their coldest months. There have also been reports that Russia is preparing to leave the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which it has occupied since March. But the Kremlin is denying these claims. And Alex, what do you have lined up for the rest of the show?
We're bringing listeners a segment of a conversation we aired during the annual policy forum earlier this month, Press the Button Live. This conversation is between Ploughshares Fund Executive Director Elizabeth Warner and the former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson. It's a great interview, and for those that missed the event, please tune in. We're also going to be bringing listeners more from the event, so do stay tuned for that.
And if you like what you hear, as always, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
Well, President Mary Robinson, thank you so much for joining us today. We're here at Press the Button Live, and it is an honor to hear from you. And I know that we wished we could have had you here in person, but I understand that you are being called to another important conference when this is going to be broadcast. Can you give us a little teaser about where you're going to be?
Yes, I'll be in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for the important COP27 on climate, the climate crisis. And it's the African COP, it's the COP for developing countries. The elders will be very strongly supporting some of the key issues that are relevant to them.
Of course. Well, thank you for that amazing work that you're doing to save the world on many fronts, including climate and from nuclear weapons. So good luck at the conference.
Thank you.
And now, for those of our audience who may not know your impressive resume of global leadership, I want to let them know that you're a founding member and the current chair of the Elders, which is the influential group of former world leaders started by Nelson Mandela in 2007. who promote peace, justice, and human rights. You're also the former president of Ireland and the first woman to hold that office. You're also the former UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. And you're an ardent champion of women's rights, human rights, and climate justice. And as we're going to be talking about today, reducing the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons. And our work with the elders has intersected most recently in 2020 when Ploughshares Fund supported the elders' work surrounding the 75th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then again in 2021, when I had the pleasure of interviewing another member of the elders, former president of Mexico, Ernesto Zedillo, for our chain reaction event. So we're really grateful for our work together. And it's really amazing that even in the short window of time that we have been working together, the world has changed dramatically. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights today on what's going on around the world. And maybe more importantly, where do we go from here? So what influenced the elders to take on nuclear weapons as a core issue in the first place?
Nuclear weapons, as you've said, present an existential threat to the future of humanity, as does climate change and the pandemic disease. And the elders chose to take this up because we've been deeply concerned about the increasing threat posed by nuclear weapons in recent years and the disturbing erosion of the taboo against using nuclear weapons, from President Trump's threats against North Korea in 2017 to President Putin's dangerous rhetoric over Ukraine. We've seen how many times the world has come close to nuclear disaster since 1945. You probably know that even better than I do. And it's largely, I believe, luck that has saved us from nuclear catastrophe. And so long as these weapons remain in existence, it's inevitable that eventually our luck may run out.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, because it is so off in the future, like a one-day kind of event, a low probability event, it's not always accessible or immediate, like issues like women's rights or climate justice. And I'm curious if there's anything personal that draws you to this issue.
During the Cold War, this was an issue that many ordinary people cared greatly about. And I remember marching with a lot of other women against nuclear weapons. It was something that we very much felt we had to give leadership on because we felt it was, important to protest about it. And sadly, there isn't the same sense of a sort of mass mobilization today, a real sense that this is an issue that we should all be waking up and saying we have to do something. Although I do think that Russia's war in Ukraine has reminded many people that the risks around nuclear weapons continue to exist. It's woken people up. I think it's very important that we speak about nuclear weapons in a way that people can find accessible and understandable, and get away from the very technical and abstract language, UN speak and other language that's used around nuclear weapons. People need to really understand the seriousness of the current threat that they pose to humanity.
I want to talk now about the strategy that the elders have. And I really acknowledge the elders for having taken some bold stances on nuclear weapons in your statements, and surrounding the hypocrisy of deterrence theory, the immorality of nuclear weapons, supporting the ban treaty, and calling out nuclear states for not signing on. But regards to the two-step process of minimizing nuclear risks in the short term and the elimination of nuclear weapons in the long term, can you explain these two strategies and maybe also talk about, like, why not just focus on the elimination from the beginning?
Well, we would of course be delighted if nuclear states were to agree to immediately eliminate nuclear weapons entirely. And it's understandable that many grassroots activists are campaigning for that goal with no qualification. I fully understand their passion and why. Our view is that the most likely path to achieving disarmament is to get nuclear states engaged on a phased, step-by-step process that starts with reducing arsenals and reducing the risks around these weapons. Even though arms control has gone backwards in recent years, we shouldn't give up on this, not least because the threat is now so serious that any steps we can make to reduce risks will be hugely important. So we have put forward what we call our 4 Ds, and we're calling on nuclear states to take action around doctrine that all nuclear states should adopt no first use, or at a minimum, make declarations that the sole purpose of their nuclear arsenals are for deterrence. And you remember the P5 did make such a statement. De-alerting is our second D. As many nuclear weapons as possible need to be taken off high alert. And deployment, the proportion of nuclear warheads that are actively deployed should be significantly reduced. And the fourth D, decreased numbers. The overall number of nuclear weapons need to be drastically cut from around 13,000 today to around not more than 2,000, with the US and Russia reducing to no more than 500 each. This would make the world a lot safer. It's not perfect, but it's the beginning of a real, strategy of disarmament.
So I want to turn now to some of the current events that have dramatically changed the political and security landscape over the past year. And I did want to circle back to the Ukraine. So how has Putin's invasion of Ukraine changed your calculus and strategy?
Oh, Putin's dangerous nuclear threats have further confirmed the urgency of action to reduce nuclear risks. We've said for some time that the world's leaders need to understand that there's no long-term security in reliance on nuclear weapons, and that increasing their role in security policy or statecraft can only bring greater risks. We've seen how Russia has used the threat of nuclear weapons against NATO to prevent it from doing more to come to the defense of a sovereign state. And we must re-examine the logic that nuclear weapons can enhance our security. We can clearly see how nuclear weapons can and are being used in ways that increase global instability and undermine our ability to hold states accountable for the most egregious crimes. The presence of nuclear weapons has also turned Russia's war on Ukraine into a conflict which poses real existential risks to the future of all humanity. It's different from other conflicts. It's that real risk now because of the threat that has been made.
And what do you think of the longer term prospects for arms control talks, with Russia once the war in Ukraine is ended?
This is a difficult question because, frankly, it depends on so many factors, and also from how the war ends, and whether we can avoid nuclear escalation and use, and the nature of a future Russian government after Ukraine. We do know that New START will expire in February 2026. And I'm very concerned, the elders are very concerned, the possibility we'll be left without any arms control treaties between the two nuclear superpowers, which would be really very worrying. The need for strengthening arms control is paramount if we're to learn the lessons from Ukraine and move to reduce the nuclear threat in the longer term. Experience has shown us that when nuclear rivals compete without guardrails and agreements, the likely result is arms racing and escalation, which ultimately makes everyone less safe. And that's what's happening. We have to keep making the case for why arms control matters and why nuclear states need to commit to working towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons as the ultimate goal.
And there's arms control on one side, and then there's non-proliferation on the other. And I'd love to ask you now about Iran. And, we're seeing incredible civil unrest following the death of Mahsa Amini at the hands of the Iran's morality police. And President of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, is blaming the US and Israel for the protests, further complicating our relationship and further isolating the Iranian government from the rest of the world, and ultimately decreasing prospects for reaching a deal. And I'm wondering what the elders' take on the JCPOA is at this time.
Yes, we've of course, watched with great anxiety the protests, the brave protests of women and girls supported by men in particular, and the government behavior towards their own people, the number that have been imprisoned, the number that have been killed. It's very shocking to see. The brave women and men of Iran are acting to advance their own freedom, and we must stand with them and against the oppressive tactics that we've seen from their government. And there's no aspect of the situation in Iran or in the Gulf region that will be improved by Iran being able to quickly pursue a nuclear weapon. That's just not acceptable. That's the purpose of the JCPOA, and why the negotiated re-adoption of that agreement is very much in the security interest of both the people of Iran and the world at large. It ultimately remains in the interests of the entire world to secure a diplomatic agreement that would prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear state. We will continue to work for that.
So the last topic that I want to ask you about is the ban treaty. And, in theory, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the ban treaty, are working towards similar long-term goals. But some see some conflict between these two. And I'm wondering how you see that.
Well, we obviously support the TPNW, and we think that the treaty has been important for strengthening the legal and normative frameworks against nuclear weapons. I've been very proud that Ireland has been one of the countries strongly supporting the TPNW. Yeah. It's also sent a clear message that the majority of the world's countries believe that nuclear weapons are entirely unacceptable and must be banned. It's important that nuclear states and their allies realize the strength of feeling at TPNW supporting countries and engage seriously with treaty supporters. I heard about all the energy that was present at the first, treaty meeting, and young people, and just the sheer passion that was evident. I was disappointed at the outcome of the NPT, but it remains a critical treaty that underpins the global non-proliferation architecture, which has real impacts in limiting the scale of global nuclear proliferation. However, the P5 states have not been adhering to the spirit of the NPT in recent years, which commits them, as we know, under Article 6, to pursue disarmament negotiations in good faith. They're not doing this, and they've gone backwards. The elders are keen to help bridge divides between countries that support and oppose the TPNW. And this will require sustained dialogue, communication, and understanding, and a recommitment by all countries to the common purpose of achieving a world without nuclear weapons. There are countries that are part of this bridge building, and we're very strongly supporting and working with them. It's not an easy task, but I'm hopeful that progress can be achieved, and I think the positive energy that has been demonstrated around the TPNW is helpful for seeking to catalyze progress.
One of the other features at this conference is a panel on issues to watch in 2023. So my question is, as our audience and community gear up for the next phase of reducing nuclear threats, what words of wisdom do you have for the next generation of peace and security advocates?
Well, it is extremely important that we have hope that is based on action for hope. And I learned a great lesson from Archbishop Tutu, the first chair of the elders. And we were on a panel together in New York, and he was accused by the moderator of being an optimist. And he said, "Oh no, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." And the reason he said that, I came to understand, is hope generates an ability to say, I can do something about this. And it catalyzes action. It gives the energy. Whereas if you describe the risks of nuclear weapons, the risks of an accident, the risks of use now in Ukraine, whatever, people just put their head down and say, well, that's too big an issue. I can't do anything about it. And we do need people to engage. We need people to understand. We need to get back to that momentum of the movement of the Cold War that I was part of and that women were so strong on. I call particularly on women and young people to give leadership on this as they're doing. And I'm so delighted that there is a growing, sense of a movement, a global movement in the right direction. And I'm 100% behind it.
May we all be prisoners of hope and called to action. I think that's a wonderful analogy. Well, President Robinson, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a delight and pleasure to hear from you. And just want to thank you on behalf of Ploughshares Fund and all of us listening today for the work that you and the elders are doing to keep the world safe and healthy for future generations. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and keep up your own good work.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyric Spawn and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.